Well, the annual Global Private Equity Conference has kicked off in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. This year's conference centers around the theme of emerging markets prevailing in a new financial landscape, identifying which markets and sectors present the most compelling investment merit. Joining us now on the line from Washington to discuss the PE sector's outlook on Africa is Hurley Doddy. He's MD and founding partner of Emerging Capital Markets. A very warm welcome to you, Hurley.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, I think the biggest question that here on the African continent an investee would be asking is what do they do to be able to access, to be able to get the kind of investment that a private equity investor would be looking to invest in?
Well, I think there's a good range, an increasing range of fund managers who are focused on the African continent, and we think that the private equity space is a good way to get that exposure. There's of course listed managers as well, but for many of these economies, it is through private equity that you can get the real growth companies.
And one of the things that has been said is that because of some of the underdeveloped markets here on the African continent, for some businesses, PE might be the only way, or PE investment might be the only way that they would be able to get the funding they need to grow their business.
Yes, clearly in many of these economies, the local stock market isn't going to allow them to raise money directly, and the banks are relatively short-term lenders. So a lot of the real growth businesses do rely on the private equity industry. Industries like the cell phone market, which has exploded across Africa, were funded to a large extent by private equity.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about if you look at some of the markets where this has happened, where you've got PE investment, it may seem to appear, just looking at the numbers, that PE investments or companies that would have been able to get this kind of funding have actually been more successful than companies that get their funding from, say, being listed on stock exchanges. Would you say that that would be kind of accurate?
I think so. One thing you would see in many of the African markets is that you have to be a pretty established company in order to actually list. You've got to be paying dividends for multiple years, this type of thing, and that precludes many of the companies in their rapid growth phase from actually getting a listing, and therefore it increases the importance of private equity to the creation of good companies. When
it comes to stewardship, and I think this is what was important from this, that it's not just funding, it's also some of the advice that a company would need, in terms of strategic goals and meeting those goals, and that some of the investors that come on board don't just put in money, but they also put in expertise. Just talk to us about how important that is, particularly with a company that would need to turn around if it was performing poorly.
Right. Well, I think the industry does add a lot of value. One thing in Africa, we've got the need in order to get scale for the companies to become regional companies and to expand into new markets, and that's something that we're able to help our companies do at ECP. Also, just getting them up to international governance standards is very important and makes them much more likely to be able to attract both international debt financing and eventually attention from international strategic buyers who are increasingly look at Africa. So at ECP, this is a real focus of how we look to add value to our companies.
Hurley, Africa is a huge continent, so I would like to just pick your brain a little bit on some of the regions that you find investors are most interested in, particularly because, one of the things about PE investments is that a PE investor would probably invest in a business that would be seen as risky, that other financial structures wouldn't touch.
That other what wouldn't touch?
Other investments, other structures would not go into, because they would consider them to be far too risky for them to be able to invest in it. And yet a PE investor would say, well, looking at the business, looking at the potential, that's something that they would look to invest in.
Yes, I think we are able to see a lot of the growth opportunities that are coming out there, and I think the track record has shown that it's in the end not that risky, that there's a lot of room for companies to grow in many of the countries across Africa, and we've been able to tap into that quite well.
So what I was asking you, Hurley, is where you see investors, most interested in when it comes to looking at and investing in Africa.
In terms of the regions?
Yes.
Well, I think Nigeria has captured a lot of attention just because the size of that economy there. I think East Africa as well has, in the last year or two, gotten a lot more attention, partly because of of course, the natural gas that's being found off of there, but also I think they're making some strides in terms of making it more of a regional market, so we can think of investing in Kenya, for instance, in order to expand into Tanzania and Uganda. And I think that's making it a more interesting market for us recently.
Hurley's sectors that are capturing investors' attention.
Well, the financial services sector continues to draw good investment into the markets. There's still a lot of underserved Africans who don't have their bank accounts and looking for services there. Telecom continues to grow. I think more recently, telecom infrastructure like cell phone towers, pay television is another area we think is interesting. And finally, the consumer-related businesses based on the growing middle class. We're seeing investments looking into quick service restaurants, a variety of real consumer-focused companies.
Hurley, I want to ask you real quick, just in terms of the potential, with a really small business that might have come up with a really fantastic, idea or a really fantastic business, and yet they're struggling. What chances do they have to be able to access this kind of funding? As you were talking about, companies that are more established having a better chance, but for the small entrepreneur who would like to, to approach a business like yours and say, invest in my company.
Right. Well, at ECP, we're looking to make a relatively large investments of 40 or 50 million, but there are increasingly some funds aimed at the SME sector. But I would have to say, unfortunately, it is an area in Africa that is underserved, and it's still quite tough for entrepreneurs to get real startup money. Though, as I said, it's improved a little bit over the last couple of years.
Thank you so much for joining us, Hurley Doddy. He is MD and founding partner of Emerging Capital Partners, giving us a view on private equity in Africa from an industry event in Washington.